everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how you doing? Grab your coffee, maybe a snack, and let's get into it. So, I have an announcement to make. Andrew and Jessica are getting married. They are. It is so exciting. I cannot wait. We have a wedding to plan. So, I'm so excited. Anyway, what we're going to be talking about today are 14 forgotten foods that our ancestors used to eat, okay? And these are not things that, you know, I guess we would normally eat, in today, Now, food, as you know, is one of those things that is the very center of culture. Like whatever your nationality is, you have certain things that you're used to, that you grew up with, right? I'm Italian, right? We have the most amazing Italian dishes I remember that my grandmother used to make, right? My mother, my aunts, that I now make. Think, what are some of those dishes that you remember growing up eating that were of your nationality? Okay? Now, when trying to understand a group of people and their lifestyle, okay, food is a key ingredient. Now, here in the United States, we eat foods from a variety of cultures. We have Italian, we have Chinese, we have Thai, Mexican restaurants. Oh, I love Mexican food. Okay? All different kinds of food. And much more so than you can find in other countries around the world. Now, at the same time, we have Americanized those foods, adding out like our own twist to them, if you will. Pizza, for example, which is an American favorite, is much more different here than it is in Italy. If you order a pizza there, you'll get a round piece of bread with some herbs on it, and that's it. Okay? Even our mozzarella is different than theirs, as they make mozzarella daily while using it while it's still soft. Now, imagine when Italian immigrants came here, okay, seeing our version of mozzarella in the grocery store. They would think you're selling old cheese, okay? Many of the foods that people have eaten throughout history are based upon availability. Truffles, which are extremely rare and expensive today, you would literally have to go to a Michelin star restaurant in order to get good truffles with your entree. Okay? And they were once something that were eaten by poor people in Europe, as they could gather them themselves. Now, throughout time, the availability of those truffles have dwindled to the point where they are now only served in very small quantities with gourmet food. People living near the equator don't eat seals because there aren't any, while people living in the Arctic Circle consume them as a part of the regular diet. As we have become more civilized, if you will, at least in our own minds, our ideas of what is acceptable cuisine has changed as well. Most women living in like the 1800s thought nothing of having a butcher and defeather a chicken, a duck, a goose, a turkey, while the average housewife today would be appalled at the idea of having to do that. Now, that's your typical housewife. If I were to have to do it, I'd be like, pluck, 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 pluck. It would not bother me at all. But to many people, fish as a food, rather than something pretty to look at, okay, in an aquarium, say, comes in rectangular pieces that are breaded and, with, gourmet, whatever. You can have blackened salmon or, whatever. And were we to put a whole cooked fish on their plate, they would probably scream and run away. I've actually, because my Uncle Elio, he is a chef, he would take redfish and cook the entire thing, eyes and all. And I'll tell you, it's the most delicious thing I've ever had. So, yet many of the foods that our ancestors ate were healthy, nutritious, providing them with the energy needed for hard physical work. So while those foods may not seem like the first things that we would put out on our own menus, they are foods that can help us stay healthy, especially in times of hardship. So now I'm going to give you a list of things that our ancestors used to eat that maybe you have eaten them. Maybe I've eaten them, but I'll tell you along the way. The first one is beaver tail. Now, this is one of the more unusual sounding foods from the frontier, was beaver tails. And beaver was hunted for their pelts, which were highly valued for making top hats before the style changed and silk was the preferred material. But the beaver tail, which was not used in the making of those hats, had its own use. The beaver stored energy in the form of fat in their tail, much like camels do with their humps and bears do in preparation for hibernation. Now, we don't think of it today in a day where saturated fats are universally frowned upon by nutritionists. But fat was one of the more difficult nutrients to come by on the frontier. Wild game typically has very little fat, yet that fat is high in calories, which our digestive system breaks down into simple sugars to provide energy to our muscles. Now, beaver tail was roasted over fire. Once the leathery skin is removed, this produces something like a pork rind. It has been replaced in modern culture partially due to the relative rarity of the beaver, and partially because we prefer to get our fat from potato chips and cookies. And I've never had beaver tail. Now the next one, stormy bug, really? The next one is salt pork. Salt pork is similar to bacon, but without anywhere near as much meat. All right, a typical slice of salt pork will have a thin strip of meat down the center, surrounded by fat, and it was the staple of army rations, with soldiers cutting their own slices of salt pork from an issue piece and frying it. Okay, now half cooked by today's standards and slipped between two halves of a biscuit, it did provide the fat necessary to give soldiers the calories that they needed. And salt was used to preserve the pork, hopefully killing the bacteria and other parasites as well. Have you ever had salt pork? No, not me either. Bacon, yeah, but salt pork, No. Now, the next one is cured meats. Cured meats, it goes all the way back to the European Middle Ages, okay, where they were created as a means of both preserving meat and finding a way of making tougher, less desirable pieces of meat of animals slaughtered edible. Much of what we know today as deli meat, lunch meat, okay, it started out as cured meats, although most of it isn't actually cured today. There are many types of cured meats, each made to specific recipes, but they all share some things in common. The meat used in making these is generally ground and mixed with fat to make it more tender. Spices, and especially salt, are added to this meat mixture to give it the particular flavor sought out, and specific quantities of nitrates are added to help with the curing process. Now, however, excess nitrates must be avoided, of course. And the meat is then stored in a cold place, giving time for the salt to work its way through the meat, killing the bacteria. Now, we can still make our own cured meats today, but it requires having refrigeration with enough room for the meat to hang during the curing process. So, you've had cured meats? Yes? Me too. Now, the next one is lard. No Stormy. Lard, rendered from animal fat, was the main cooking oil of the past. You save your bacon grease? Me too. Okay? Those who live in areas with high populations of people of Mexican descent may find lard in their local supermarkets, as it is critical with the preparation of tamales and flour tortillas. Now, properly prepared, lard does not grow mold, but it can grow rancid, okay? And this made rendering lard a common occurrence on the frontier. Lard can be readily substituted for shortening, cooking oil, butter, even today. And lard is most often rendered from pig fat. Like I said, I save all the bacon grease, right? And all that fat can be scavenged from the carcass is used in order to have enough to make it worth the trouble. This includes the fat that surrounds the organs, like the kidneys, that protects them, okay? But it also includes back fat, what we would normally think of as, like I said, bacon, and fat on the edges of all the cuts of meat. And by the way, pigs raised for rendering lard are a different breed than those used for getting bacon. So be sure to raise the right kind of hog, okay? The next one is squirrel. Probably one of the most common sources of meat during the pioneering days was squirrel. Now, while a single squirrel does not contain as much meat, they are in abundance, making them easy to hunt, either around the homestead, while traveling. And the trick to hunting squirrel is that the firearm of the day were too large a caliber for the animal being shot. A .50 caliber bullet from a rifle would probably blow away half the meat in the animal anyway while, hunting it. So they didn't have 22, rifles, which would be the firearm of choice today. Rather, they would bark the squirrel, okay, hitting the branch it was sitting on, so it would cause the bark of the tree to explode off of it, hitting the squirrel with the bark and either stunning it or killing it. All right, now squirrel can either be cleaned, skinned, and roasted, or the meat can be stripped from the carcass and cooked. However, it is usually easier to roast the meat and then remove it from the bones in order to use it for soups and stews. The next one is other rodents. Now, all sorts of rodents, from mice to rabbits, have been eaten at one time or another. While they don't have as much meat as larger game. Oh, and by the way, no, I have never eaten squirrel. Rodents are in abundance and they multiply rapidly, all right, making them an easy addition to the larder. And rabbit is still considered to be a delicacy in some circles. So I know it's Native Americans hunting baby mice, eating them whole. They would follow a field mouse back to its hole, digging up the hole to find baby mice inside. Now, these would be grabbed by the tail, dipped in honey to make them slide down their throats easier. I know, yuck, yuck. But, yeah. Have I ever eaten? No. Have I even eaten rabbit? No. Okay. So, the next one is turtle. I've never had turtle. All right. A popular European delicacy that was brought to these lands by settlers. Turtles used to be more commonplace and easier to catch, making them a popular food and generally used in soups. And once you get through the hard shell, there aren't many bones in the way. Alligator. Yes, I have had alligator. Alligator tail, actually. If you fry up alligator, it actually kind of tastes like chicken. So, speaking of reptiles, people who settled in Louisiana and the bayou, okay, they quickly recognized the food value in the area of alligator. And a fully grown alligator has a lot of meat on it, even though they are a bit hard to catch and kill, okay. There is a sweet spot, if you will, just behind the rectangle hard plate on the top of their head. It's about the size of a golf ball. And if you hit that area, you just might be able to bag that gator. Yeah. Even a bullet, it's a .380, placed in this spot, that gator is no more. Okay. Otherwise, you're better off taking a shot, while its mouth is open, okay, as the hide of a gator is all but impossible to penetrate because the scales are so thick, okay. Now, alligators, they do have a lot of fat, necessary because they don't feed very often, all right. Now, the fat is very gamey tasting, so you want to dispose of that when cleaning and butchering that animal. An 8-foot long gator will yield about 40 pounds of meat. Yeah. Now, smaller gators, they're better for eating as the larger ones because the meat's tougher. Okay. Now, animal organs. There's many parts of an animal which we don't knowingly eat today, although they may be eaten in other countries. Like, I'm going to go there, okay? Brain, heart, liver, other organs would be eaten rather than allowing the meat to go to waste. Now, while those might not show up in place of a steak on one's plate, they would often find their way into a soup or a stew, diced up, cooked, and mixed into the soup. Now, if I ever find out that there's brain, I'm a puke. Okay? Just saying. Now, the next one, and no, I have never eaten an organ of any kind. No. So the next one is squash. Now, while we still, we eat, all types of squash today, it isn't anywhere near as commonplace as it was during the pioneer days. There are many different types of squash, such as pumpkin, acorn squash, spaghetti squash, butternut squash, honey nut squash, buffalo gourd. Okay, I love squash. I eat it all the time. Squash was popular to grow in those times, and they had a lot of calories and stored extremely well in a root cellar. And many meals were based upon some sort of squash, generally made into like a soup. Now, what meat they had, such as squirrel, was added to this, providing protein and flavor. Okay. The next one, chicory coffee. In times and places where coffee was hard to come by, people would either replace that coffee or stretch their coffee supply by mixing it with chicory root. And the root would be minced, roasted, ground up, and then either mixed with coffee grounds or brewed solo to make coffee. Yeah. The next one is bread pudding. I love bread pudding. I make it for every holiday. Okay. Now, this is one of the few foods on the list in which some people still eat today. I love it. I love it. All right. And although, you know, a lot of people don't eat it for the same reason. Okay. People living on the frontier could not afford to waste anything. Making bread pudding gave them a way of using bread crusts. Yeah, you would never think that, right? I know. And leftover ends and other scrap pieces. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the bread that they ate back then was much denser than the kind of bread that we have today. Okay. You couldn't get Wonder Bread, all right? You know what I'm saying, okay? And the leavening was that usually used was bacteria that was captured from the air or sourdough starter. And this only caused the bread to rise just a little bit, okay, compared to the yeast or the baking soda used in baking bread today. All right, they didn't have rapid rising yeast like we have it today, right? So to make the bread pudding, roughly 2 cups of stale bread is used, which was cubed, and this is mixed with milk and sugar and butter or lard, a couple of eggs, a pinch of salt mixed together. This is placed in a Dutch oven. Do you have a Dutch oven? I do. I love it. Which is then put on the coals on the fire just to bake. Okay. Now the next one is fritters. Who here has made fritters? Raise your hand. Okay. Corn fritters. Love it. Now fritters are pan-baked or deep-fried fixings of like mixtures of different foods. Okay. They became a great way of using up leftovers, much like left side of the refrigerator soup. You know, almost anything can be used to make them, which made fritters a great way of using veggies found in on a foraging trip. Okay, a basic fritter recipe requires like mashed potatoes, flour, or both, really. The other ingredients are cut up and added to the batter, and then either fried in oil or deep fried. Okay. Now the next one is corn soup. Okay. And corn was like one of the better crops to grow on the frontier, both because of the amount of the yield that they would get from an acre of corn and because of the ease of separating the edible corn from the rest of the plant. Okay. And corn can be either cooked directly or dried and used as grain. All right. Now, cornbread, which we still eat today, I love it, with some honey. Oh, yeah. Yum, yum. Especially in the South, is a pioneer recipe. Yeah. And it was easier for people who had to grind their grains in order to bake with them and grind the corn than to grind wheat and other grains. So dried corn can be rehydrated as well in a stock pot, turning it into soup. With greens and peppers, potatoes, eggs, meat could be added to it, using whatever was at hand to make a savory soup. So, you know, this is just a really great list of things to, you know, write down in your prepper notebook. And, you know, it's like something to keep in the back of your head. Well, you know, if I can't, you know what I mean? All right, guys, I'm out of here. I love you. I'll see you in the next one. You stay safe. You stay positive. You keep prepping. And as always, fear less. Ciao.